Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University.
Namaskar and greetings of the day to all the students watching this video. I, Twinkle Chandarana, Assistant Professor English, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University. Welcome all of you in today's lecture. Well friends, today we are going to discuss an interesting dramatic monologue titled as My Last Duchess, written by Robert Browning. Let us first discuss the components of this video lecture. This video lecture contains introduction of the poem, brief summary of the poem, themes as discussed in the poem, check your progress questions, and references and web resources which would be further helpful to you. Let us start with the discussion of the introduction of the poem. Robert Browning published My Last Duchess in the year 1842 in a book of poems titled Dramatic Lyrics. As the title suggests, in these poems, Browning experiments with form, combining some aspects of stage plays and some aspects of romantic verse to create a new type of poetry for his own Victorian age. The Victorians are the poor unfortunates who come between the romantics and the modernist. In other words, authors in this period got sandwiched between two great movements that majorly influenced the Western culture. And so readers sometimes forget about the Victorian age writers. It's important to notice that My Last Duchess is one of the poems that falls into this somewhat problematic in-between age. For reference, you can think of the Victorian era as stretching from the year 1837 to 1901. For the most part, poetry did not do so well in the Victorian period, as it was the age of the novel, and everyone was reading either Charles Dickens or Eliot or Penny Dreadful, which were the Victorian version of the sensationalist paperbacks sold in your local grocery store today. Most Victorian poets were highly experimental, and with the exception of Lord Alfred Tennyson, not so highly popular. People kept reading the now classic romantic poets like William Wordsworth and Lord Byron instead of tuning into the new developments in poetry. Robert Browning alarmed his Victorian readers with psychological and sometimes psychopathic realism, wild formal experiments, and harsh sounding language. These qualities, however, are what make poems like My Last Duchess so attractive to today's readers who value the raw power of Browning's writing more than some of the feel-good, flowery romantic poems. Browning's inspiration for My Last Duchess was the history of a Renaissance Duke, Alfonso II of Ferrara, whose young wife Lucrezia died in suspicious circumstances in the year 1561. Lucrezia was a Medici part of a family that was becoming one of the most powerful and wealthy in Europe at the time. During Lucrezia's lifetime, however, the Medici were just beginning to build their power base and were still considered upstarts by the other nobility. Lucrezia herself never got to enjoy riches and status. She was married at just the age of 14 and was dead in the age of 17. After her death, Alfonso courted and eventually married the niece of the Count of Tyrol. Browning takes this brief anecdote out of the history books and turns it into an opportunity for readers to peek inside the head of a psychopath. Although Browning hints at the real-life Renaissance backstory by putting the word Ferrera under the title of the poem as an epigraph, he removes the situation from most of its historical details. It's important to notice that the Duke, his previous wife, and the woman he's quoting are not named in the poem at all. Even though there were historical events that inspired the poem, the text itself has a more generalized, universal, and nameless feel. Friends, this was a brief introduction of the poem. Let us now discuss the analysis and summary of the poem. The speaker, that is the Duke of Ferrara, directs the attention of a guest to a painting of his former wife, the Duchess of Ferrara, which hangs on the wall. The Duke praises the painting for looking so lifelike and then remarks on how hard the painter, that is Fra Pandolf, worked on it. The Duke asks the guest to sit and look at the work. The Duke then explains that he deliberately mentioned the name of the painter because strangers, like the emissary, always look at the Duchess' painted face with its deep, passionate and earnest glance and turn to the Duke and only the Duke, since only he pulls back the curtain that reveals the painting, and act as though they would ask, if they dared, how an expression like that came into her face. The Duke reiterates that the guests are not the first person to ask this question. The Duke continues by saying that it was not only his presence that brought that look into the painted eyes of the Duchess, or the blush of happiness into her painted cheek. He suggests that perhaps Fra Pandolf had happened to compliment her by saying, "Her shawl drapes over her wrist too much," or "Paint could never recreate the faint half blush that's fading on her throat." The Duke insists that the former Duchess thought that polite comments like those were the reason enough to blush, and criticizes her in a halting way for being too easily made happy or impressed. He also claims that she liked everything and everyone she saw, although his description suggests that she was ogling everyone who crossed her path. The Duke objects that to his former Duchess, everything was the same and made her equally happy, whether it was a brooch or present from him that she wore at her chest, or the sun setting in the west, or let it be a branch of cherries which some interfering person snapped off a tree in the orchard for her, or the white mule she rode on around the terrace. He claims that she would say the same kind words or give the same blush in response to all of them. The Duke also objects to her manner of thanking men, although he struggles to describe his concerns. Specifically, he complains that she values his pedigree and social position, his 900-year-old name, as equally important to anyone else's gift to her. The Duke rhetorically asks whether anyone would actually lower themselves enough to argue with someone about their behavior. The Duke imagines a hypothetical situation wherein he would confront the former Duchess. He says that even if he were good with words and were able to clearly say, "This characteristic of yours disgusts me," or "Here you did too little or too much," and if the former Duchess had let herself be degraded by changing, instead of being stubborn and making excuses, that even then the act of confronting her would be beneath him, and he refuses to ever lower himself like that. The Duke then returns to his earlier refrain about his former wife's indiscriminate happiness and complains to his guest that while the Duchess did smile at him whenever they passed, she gave everyone else the same smile as well. The Duke explains that she began smiling at others even more, so he gave orders and all her smiles stopped forever, presumably because he had her killed. Now she only lives on in the painting. The Duke then asks the guest to stand up and to go with him to meet the rest of the guests downstairs. He also says that the Count, revealed here as the guest's master and the father of the Duke's prospective bride-to-be, is so known for his generosity in matters of money that no request the Duke could make for a dowry could be turned down. The Duke also adds quickly that he has always insisted since the beginning of their discussions that the Count's beautiful daughter and not the dowry is his primary objective. The Duke ends his speech by demanding that he and the Count's emissary go downstairs together, and on their way, he directs the emissary's attention to a statue of the god Neptune taming a seahorse, which is a rare work of art that Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze specifically for him. Having discussed the brief analysis of the poem, let us now have a look at the various themes of the poem. The first theme is the objectification of woman. My Last Duchess is a dramatic monologue in which the Duke of Ferrara tells the messenger of his potential wife's family about his previous wife, the last Duchess of the poem's title. Using a painting of that former Duchess as a conversation piece, he describes what he saw as her unfaithfulness, frivolity, and stubbornness, and implies that he prefers her as a painting rather than as a living woman. Throughout the poem, the Duke reveals his belief that women are objects to be controlled, possessed, and discarded. In many ways, this reflects the thinking of Browning's own era, when Victorian social norms denied women the right to be fully independent human beings. Through this portrayal of the Duke, Browning critiques such a viewpoint, presenting sexism and objectification or as dehumanizing processes that rob women of their full humanity. The Duke's treatment of the painting reflects his treatment of women as objects to be owned. His description of the painting as a piece and a wonder portray it as a work of art rather than a testament to a former love. By repeating the name of the painter, the famous Fra Pandolf, 3 times in the first 16 lines of the poem, he again implies that he values the painting because of its status as an object that shows off his wealth and clout. The painting is meant to aggrandize the Duke rather than honor the woman it portrays. This is made even clearer by the fact that the Duke has placed this painting in a public area of his palace, so he can proudly display it to guests, whom he invites to sit and look at her, much like a museum curator would direct visitors to a famous work of art in a gallery. Such an attitude is reflected yet again when he tells the messenger that the Count's fair daughter's self-object he intends to make his new bride another one of his possessions. Women, in the Duke's mind, are simply ornamental objects for men rather than actual people in their own right. The poem thus implies that the Duke finds his former wife's actions unforgivable because they reflected her status as an independent person rather than an inanimate possession. Her crimes appear to be not romantic infidelity but rather being happy or too soon made glad, appreciative of others, because she considered the Duke's gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's else gift. She was self-confident, she would not let herself to be lessened, and willing to stand up for herself. She plainly set her wits to his. The Duke, however, appears to believe that a husband owes his wife and therefore has the right to dictate her feelings and to be the sole recipient of her happiness, kindness, and respect. And any indication that she has thoughts or feelings of her own are unacceptable. Ultimately, the poem heavily implies that the Duke was so vexed by the idea that his former wife had an inner life of her own that she had the last Duchess killed. Of course, the Duke avoids explicitly confessing to assassinating his wife, and Browning himself allegedly once said in an interview that the Duke may have simply had her sent to a convent. Regardless, the outcome is the same. There is no last Duchess present in the poem to speak for herself and give her side of the story. The poem thus underscores how objectifying women ultimately silences them, robbing them of their voices and autonomy. Friends, the second theme is of social status, art, and elitism in the poem. Though the poem does not outrightly condemn the Duke, it does suggest that he is a brutish figure whose social status is in no way a reflection of any sort of moral worth. The Duke repeatedly draws his guests' attention to his wealth, his power, and issues veiled threats about what happens to those who don't put a high enough price on his social standing. Through the Duke, the poem takes a subtle jab at the snobbery of the upper class, suggesting the shallowness of an elitist society that bestows respect based on things like having a good family name or owning fancy artwork. Instead, the poem reveals the various ways in which powerful men like the Duke may use such markers of status simply to manipulate and dominate those around them. The Duke repeatedly reminds the messenger of the power in his title. He does this in part by mentioning the famous artist, that is Frappendolf and Claus of Innsbruck, who created works especially for him, but also by mentioning his very old name, that is 900 years old name. The Duke then moves quickly from intimidation to intimidated threats when he hints that he had his former wife killed for not valuing his status sufficiently. He objects that she ranked his 900 old years name with anybody's gift, and so he gave commands that stopped her smiles. Since the Duke and his potential father-in-law, that is the Count, are about to sit down to discuss the fiance's dowry, they will put a price on exactly how much his name is worth. Consequently, the Duke's claim that the Count's generosity is ample warrant that the Count will give him a substantial amount of money for the daughter's dowry can actually be read as a veiled threat. The Duke implies that if the in-laws want their daughter to live, they will value his name and pay him a large sum. Immediately, before beginning negotiations with the prospective in-laws, the Duke also tells the emissary to admire a statue of Neptune taming a seahorse made by a famous sculptor. The Duke emphasizes the statue's aesthetic merit as a means of imbuing himself with more importance. The statue is a rarity and was created just for him. This moment has nothing to do with the Duke emphasizing his refined taste and his appreciation of art. Instead, Again, it serves as a warning. Neptune was the Roman god of the sea, and the statue depicts this god forcefully subduing a creature who challenged him. By drawing the emissary's attention to this statue before the negotiation, the Duke implies that he himself is a godlike figure like Neptune, who will tame the emissary and the Count, just as he did with the former Duchess. The trappings of upper-class status are again mainly a means for the Duke to bully people. The Duke's seemingly refined manner and opulent surroundings are thus no indication that he is any better than those with lesser means or that he is even a decent person at all. Through this depiction, the poem offers a subtle rebuke of elitism and the upper class to men like the Duke. Beauty is not something to be valued and appreciated. Instead, it is only something to dominate. The third theme in the poem is of control and manipulation as depicted. Closely tied to the Duke's repeated emphasis on his social status and his objectification of women is his clear desire for control. By treating women as objects to be possessed, the Duke can more readily dominate them, and similarly by drawing attention to his title and social clout, the Duke can intimidate others into following his commands. Yet the poem also draws attention to quieter forms of control, as the Duke dictates everything from the flow of conversation with his guest to the choreography of the scene itself. Through these forms of asserting dominance, the poem suggests the power and danger of such inconspicuous manipulation, which is made all the more insidious by its subtlety. The Duke uses his social status indicated by his ancient name and opulent artwork to intimidate and threaten his guest. And more discreetly, however, Browning also shows the Duke controlling the conversation via its physical setting. The Duke has staged the area with the Duchess painting. The painting is behind a curtain so that he can limit who can view it, and thereby reminding his audience that he can give and take away whatever he wants. He has also placed a seat in front of the painting so he can command visitors to sit while he tells the story of his former wife, a power dynamic that literally elevates him above anyone else in the room. The Duke likewise controls the flow of the conversation. He never gives the messenger a chance to speak, and once goes so far as to pretend that the messenger has asked a question. Not the first are you to turn and ask thus, even though the messenger himself remains silent. This action gives the messenger the illusion of being an active participant in the conversation without having any actual agency in it whatsoever. Most intriguingly, there is nothing improvisatory about the Duke's words, even when he trips over them. He comments that strangers who have seen the painting have asked him about the former Duchess' expression, and that the messenger is not the first to inquire. The Duke's insistence that others have asked about the Duchess' expression suggests that he has given this spiel about his wife's supposedly inappropriate behavior to others. It is hard to believe, therefore, that his interjections about his inarticulateness, how shall I say, or somehow I know not how, are genuine hesitations. If he has given this speech before, then presumably he knows what to say and how. In other words, his actions contradict his stated lack of expertise. The improvised nature of the Duke's speech, then, with its self-interruptions and hesitations, might all be an act. He He is so committed to controlling others that he seemingly rehearses even his moments of self-depreciation and seemingly uncertainty. He says he does not have any skill in speech, meaning he is not a good talker, but this clearly is not the case. By having the Duke deliver the dramatic monologue to the emissary, addressed throughout the poem as you, Browning forces his readers to experience the Duke's manipulation to better understand how abuse of power operates. This form of address can encourage readers to imagine how they themselves would respond in such a situation. Would they notice the manipulation and feel resentful, or would it slip past as they found themselves convinced by the Duke's subtle coercion? Let us discuss the questions. The first question is, evaluate My Last Duchess as an excellent piece of dramatic monologue by Browning. Give your reasons for the same. And the second question is, what are the various themes as depicted in the poem Last Duchess? The web resources which may be useful to you for further enlightenment are shump.com or CliffNotes or GradeSaver. Dear friends, this was a brief overview of the poem My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. I hope that you would have understood the essence and the topics covered in this lecture. Thank you for watching, dear friends.